Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. We'll just give it a couple of seconds to see if there's any other people who'd like to join. But yeah, thank you so much for joining for us on today's webinar. So we'll be discussing identification, adjustments, and impact. But before I just introduce our two speakers today, I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping topics. So you'll notice your cameras are off by default. That's totally a preference. If you'd like to turn your camera on, that's completely up to you. Your microphone will also be set as default off, but if you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand or pop a message in the Q&A, and our colleague James here will just enable your microphone. A couple of other points. Today's webinar is being recorded, so we will be able to share that with you at a later date, probably later on in the week. And as I mentioned, we've got a Q&A box, so we'd love for you to ask any questions. We've had a few sent through already, but if you do think of a question at any point, at any time, please just pop it into the box, and I'll either pose it to Louise or to Aaron, or we'll hold it for discussion at the end. So, without further ado, delighted to introduce our speakers. So we've got Dr. Louise Karwowski, who's Director of Education at Cognassist, and our guest speaker today, Aaron Crudge, who's our Apprentice Support Executive at Multiverse. And today, what we're going to be covering is an overview of neurodiversity. I know a lot of you will be very familiar with that, but providing a bit of context to what the starting point is for that. A bit of introduction to Cognassist and what we do and how we help. And then Aaron's going to be walking us through reasonable adjustments, learning support funding, and an example of identification, application, and impact, and then a step-by-step process of the above and claiming. And as I mentioned, we've got about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A for any questions you'd like to raise. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Louise.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thanks for the intros and big welcome to Aaron. Love working with Multiverse. So a little bit of introduction to begin with before I do hand over to Aaron. I'd like to explain about this bit of research that we've conducted at Cognassist, which is really interesting. When we talk about this concept of neurodiversity, we're acknowledging that there are distinct ways of thinking, creating more unusual traits and recognizable challenges. But we all experience some differences in our cognition and the way we think, learn, and process information. Very few people actually have a more statistically typical cognitive profile. So far at Cognassist, we've analysed more than 250,000 cognitive profiles. And our data tells us that less than 10% of people have what some might call a neurotypical profile. This idea that an average or set standard of a human mind existing simply isn't true. So when it comes to prioritising neuro-inclusion, understanding people's differences and creating flexible learning and working environments becomes critical to well-being and culture. Next slide, please, Joe. We can't think about one concept without the other. So neurological differences come with their own cognitive strengths. For example, creativity for ADHD, pattern recognition for autism, and visualizing solutions for dyslexia. So what we see as two different concepts have much more in common. So when you look at these definitions side by side, there's not a huge difference. Both areas focus on understanding our unique experiences, how we think and process the world around us. And when we combine these concepts, organisations get the benefits of having diverse and innovative teams and learners while also supporting effective neuro-inclusion to make sure that neurodistinct minds can thrive. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot from a page from our enhanced report. So those of you familiar with Cognassist will be very well versed in the 8 domains that we previously measured. We now measure 9 domains. So we've added the reading decoding domain, and we've provided a sophisticated identification of needs within this report. So those 9 domains feed up into 3 overarching indexes that you can see there in the big circles. So this helps tutors quickly determine and more easily determine where support is needed urgently. So matching an index absolutely requires reasonable adjustments and additional support. Matching in 2 or 3 enhances that need as well. And of course, this information, whether a learner is matched in a domain or an index, provides your accurate starting point to help plan an effective pathway of learning as required by Ofsted, as Marina speaks of there. So next slide, please. So now I'd like to hand over to Aaron to talk about Multiverse's experience with learning support.
Thank you very much, Louise, and good afternoon, everyone. We've been working with Cognassist now for about 6 years, and it forms a core part of our adjustments and funding claim processes, and we'll cover more of those in today's session. But it's a core part of both of those processes, ensuring that we're able to deliver the support to our apprentices on programme that they need, right the way through from the start to end point through their programmes.
So, Aaron, could you give us a little bit of a definition of what reasonable adjustments are?
Of course. I'll just start off by going through this at a fairly high level and going through kind of our definition and the way that we define reasonable adjustments to our apprentices and our coaches as well on programme. And these are changes or modifications that are made by the provider to remove or reduce the disadvantage that your learners experience due to a need, condition, a learning difficulty, or disability. And as I'm sure everyone on this session is aware, as training providers, we have a legal duty under the Equality Act 2010 to provide these adjustments to our learners on programme. So the purpose of these adjustments is that we're looking to provide a level playing field for each learner, affording them a full opportunity to thrive on their learning experience. So there's 2 ways that we can think about the way that we do this for our learners. There's 2 things that every adjustment should be for each learner. First of all, they should be equitable and tailored. The focus should always be on equity rather than equality, and giving the learner the level of support that they need to allow them a full opportunity to thrive on their programs. The way that I often frame this to our coaches is that the opportunity should be equal, but not the experience. And by doing this, we're trying to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach for each learner, and ensuring that we're tailoring to the impact of the learner's need. And secondly, our focus is on being reasonable. By putting into place this support, we're not looking to unfairly advantage the learner, but instead granting them an equal opportunity to thrive on their programs, putting them at the same footing as every other learner on programme.
Wonderful. Have you got any advice on actual implementation of reasonable adjustments, Aaron?
Absolutely. So just to start off as well with kind of the benefit that these can deliver to you as a provider, as well as to your learners, providing adjustments effectively, it can massively help to improve your overall learner performance, and this can contribute to improve retention, satisfaction in your learners as well, and improve program outcomes. And as a result, it's crucial for both you and your learners to ensure that across the board adjustments are being provided effectively. And the way that I always think about doing this is by breaking it down into 3 core aspects that we'll go through now. Starting off with the learner, of course. Of course, the a learner should be at the heart of this entire process, ensuring that we're tailoring support to the impact of the learner's needs, ensuring that we can provide them with an equal experience on program. We're making sure that we're taking into account the strengths of the learner as well as their weaknesses. So often, this concept of neurodiversity can be seen as a deficit or a weakness. And as we've covered already during this session, there are so many strengths of neurodiverse learners as well. And actually putting into place reasonable adjustments is as much about allowing them to maximize their strengths as well as supporting any weaknesses on program. By taking into account your learner's strengths and weaknesses, we can avoid that kind of one-size-fits-all approach that I've mentioned previously, and ensuring that we're tailoring to the impact of the learner. A one-size-fits-all approach will never work for each learner because there will be things that are missed. And the second sort of pillar to consider is the program itself. And we want to consider the program structure and how the impact of your learner's needs is likely to change during the program. It's unlikely that the impact of your learner's needs is going to be the same throughout the program. For example, the impact of a condition in a spoken presentation is unlikely to be the same in a written exam, and you'll want to consider how the impact of your learner's needs is likely to change depending on the nature of the work that they're completing, be it on program or in assessments. Do you need to deliver different adjustments at different stages of the program for the same learner in different components of the program? The likely answer is yes. And that's something that can often be missed when considering adjustments. It's not a one-stop shop type thing. And that links into my final point, and that is adapting and iterating. Adjustments, as I've said, are not a one-time implementation and should be reviewed continuously right the way through the program. At the start, you may find that you're having to make assumptions or predictions about the impact of your learner's needs, and these may turn out differently as the program progresses. You may need to revise or adapt this support with your learner throughout the program, building on knowledge that you gain right the way through the program, and that's absolutely fine. Sometimes it can feel like that you've made a mistake, perhaps, or not got your support right, and that's absolutely not the case. Adapting your support right the way through the program is absolutely normal and absolutely the right thing to do for both you and your learners, and that should continue right the way through to endpoint as well. So right the way through from the start of the program, right the way through to the end of their programs as well.
Ideal. Could you provide some examples of reasonable adjustments from Cognassist, Aaron?
Absolutely. So for each learner, you'll see that if on Cognassist they are identified in any of the domains or cognitive indexes on the assessment, that as part of that assessment report, there will be a kind of starting point of recommendations for support and to consider for your learners. Of course, this is only a starting point, and you might find that there are other adjustments if your learners could benefit from. But some common examples of adjustments that we put into place for apprentices following Cognassist assessments can include things like extra time in exams and assessments. It can include things like rest breaks in exams and assessments as well. Adapting the format of materials in delivery sessions and in assignments, for example. Adapting the format of I think that.
Not sure if have we just lost you, Aaron, there for a second? Oh, hopefully he will return in a mo. We'll just give him a second. But just as we pause for a second, it'd be great if you've got any questions, please drop them into the Q&A. As a reminder as well, we've had a couple, as I said, that have come through. Hopefully Aaron's internet will kick back in, the nature of the world we live in. But yeah, But Louise, I don't know if you want to dwell on any of those points. I mean, a couple of the things we've talked about, I suppose, are the different types of adjustments, especially that Cognassist kind of provide. I don't know if you want to talk through any of those, like more recent examples that Aaron was using.
Absolutely. So Aaron touched on extra time. So our enhanced report now actually recommends extra time for speed of working and speed of processing challenges. So it makes it really easy and clear for providers to understand where to apply for that specific accommodation. And the reason we've included that in the enhanced report is because it is one of the most common reasonable adjustments that is applied for. But actually, sometimes people aren't completely sure how to apply for it, where it should be applied for, and which assessment modality it is relevant for as well. So we've wanted to make that process as seamless as possible for providers right through to EPAOs. Should say as well, we have built upon our reasonable adjustments pages. So we've made them more robust. We've added more reasonable adjustments for you to consider with your learners as per assessment modality as well. So it's well worth having a look at the new enhanced report if you haven't already. The other thing I wanted to touch upon was that point that Aaron made, which is any reasonable adjustments that are considered and used on programs successfully for a learner should absolutely continue through Gateway right through to endpoint assessment. We have had reports from EPAOs that there's a lack of reasonable adjustment applications being made, even though they are there on program, they're not always there at endpoint assessment. So that's a really valid point that Aaron made as well. It should be seamless, and any useful reasonable adjustment should be mirrored at endpoint as well.
Yep, such a valid point. We've got one question in the box. Thank you, Nicola. Do you have an example of your reasonable adjustments policy? I guess it could probably be an example of our report, but yeah, from your side, Louise.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got an internal reasonable adjustments policy. We have a neurodiversity policy as well. That we'd be happy to share a template with you, Nicola, if that's something that you're looking for as well. Absolutely. We've enhanced our recruitment processes to include reasonable adjustment policies, for example. So it's about attracting right from the start and then supporting employees internally as well.
Definitely. And we've also had, I'm hoping Aaron's going to jump back in as he's left now. So hopefully he'll come back in. But whilst he's not there, we've just got a couple of other questions. They're mainly, I suppose, for Aaron. But I guess one of them beforehand, we've had a couple of other questions. Yeah, could you send us all the templates? Yes, that's perfect. Right, let me just scroll up from the messaging. That's good. What I'm thinking is that we could move on to the next slide, and maybe we could just touch on because I think we've covered this as Cognassist, and we've covered this with going back with back in the summer as well. So I think it's always an important one to talk about. But maybe Louise, if you just want to walk through a couple of the key points, and then hopefully Aaron will jump back in and take over.
Yeah, absolutely. So learning support funding is there to support reasonable adjustments as well. So anything that incurs a cost to your organisation when you are delivering additional support can be claimed back through learning support funding. So sometimes learners might require reasonable adjustments. So, reasonable adjustments aren't always attached to a cost. That is something to note. Sometimes, quite often actually, reasonable adjustments are free to implement because they're strategies to level the playing field for your learners. However, sometimes there may be direct costs associated with reasonable adjustments. For example, the purchase of specialised equipment. Okay, so you might be looking at ergonomic equipment, for example, ergonomic keyboards, ergonomic mice, furniture as well. Or you might be looking at indirect costs, such as an additional tutor or coach investment or additional time with the learner. So these things are classed as reasonable adjustments that you can claim back through learning support funding. In cases, you're basically looking to offset these costs. And Aaron will be talking us through the actual process of claiming these costs back as well, through how Multiverse does it. It is a really good way to ensure you can deliver reasonable adjustments to your learners, even if these adjustments are more intensive or specialist. So they really do need consideration, but it does help to ensure that learners who need the support are most able to receive it, without it actually becoming a financial burden to you as a training provider. What's important to note is that you are claiming for costs in the months that support is provided. So when we've heard from Lisa Smith, for example, from RSM, when we asked her where is the place that training providers tend to be caught out on when it comes to claiming learning support funding, and she said that's the major one, where you tick the box for a month that support hasn't been provided. So that's something you really need to be hot on. But otherwise, definitely explore learning support funding as access to reasonable adjustment support for learners who require it. And I can see Aaron's jumped back in there.
Hello, Aaron.
Hello, Aaron.
Oh, you're on mute at the moment, hopefully.
There we go. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
brilliant. Yeah, good.
I'm so sorry about that. My internet chose now to drop out. I'm so sorry.
Of course it did. That's what it
I'm
does.
so
That's
sorry,
live.
Bo.
Honestly, do not worry at all. Thanks. Great for joining back. So just to recap, Louise has kind of covered off a bit of this slide just from the key points, but maybe if you want to provide a quick summary from your side, and we'll move through. If that sounds good.
Yeah, of course. Louise, what did you get up to? And I'll just continue from where we left off.
I think I've pretty much covered the slide, to be fair. I think we're good for the next one, Joe.
Yep, no problem at all.
Yeah.
Maybe actually this will be great actually to hear from your side and the process as well, Aaron. Thanks.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Perfect. And apologies again, everyone, for dropping off for a second. Perfect. So I'm just going to go into some guidance and some advice, sort of claiming learning support funding and ensuring that we're kind of meeting the requirements that we have in place from the ESFA to do this. So for us to claim learner support funding, as I'm sure you're aware, we must ensure as training providers that there's a range of evidence that we're collecting on our learners' support needs, and that provision that we're providing has been collated into a support plan that can be made available at any time to the ESFA for audit. And there's a number of core pieces of evidence that we'll go through today. But before we do that, a key message that I'd like to sort of make clear in this slide is the fact that actually this process on this screen actually it should sound quite familiar. And the reason for that is because this process should be being put into place for every apprentice that requires reasonable adjustments on their programs, and actually this funding it should be available in the cases where those adjustments do incur a cost to you and your organisation. So we'll start off by going through the evidence that is required. And the first piece of that is evidence of need identification. Essentially, evidence that your learner has some kind of need, and that can be a diagnosis, but equally it could be the outcomes from Cognassist and an assessment of Cognassist. It doesn't have to be a formal diagnosis of need to be eligible for funding in these instances. And the second piece of evidence that we need is our assessment of need and impact for the learner. What is the impact of your learner's need, and is this significant? As I'm sure you're aware, a huge part of the funding rules it relates to the impact and significance of your learner's need, and only learners with a need that is deemed significant can have funding claimed for them. So a good way of thinking about this is it does the impact of your learner's need put their program at risk? If this learner didn't have support in place on their programs, could they be at risk of not completing their program? And that's a decision which you as the provider has the freedom and the choice to make. So it's a choice for you to make for each learner. Do you deem their need to be significant? And if so, that then links on to our third piece of evidence, and that is our assessment of support. So if we've identified that our learner has a need that we've judged to be significant, what support and reasonable adjustments are going to be required to remove or reduce that disadvantage, and what support is going to be needed to get them through their apprenticeships or program that they're on. And does this support incur a cost to you as a provider? These costs may be direct costs, as I call them, or indirect costs. So, for example, a direct cost, it could be something like the purchase of a piece of technology or software, where you're actually paying an external supplier in order to deliver the support to your learner. And an indirect cost could be the provision of additional support from your tutors or coaches that actually impact your ability to take on further learners and support them through their program. So there's two different types of costs as you can think about in these instances. And once you've understood what support your learner requires, the next step is to provide that support. And so implementing this support and providing evidence of that support implementation, and also, has this support actually incurred a cost, and can we evidence that alongside everything else? And finally, we want to be making sure that every month we're reviewing with our learners the support that's currently in place, and whether this is actually supporting them towards the completion of their programs. So earlier I mentioned that we want to assess the support that is required to overcome or mitigate the difficulty of your learner experiences. At this stage, you want to understand, is this actually working as planned? And are there any changes that need to be made going forward? If so, what are they? And all of these 5 things form the evidence that then supports a funding claim. And this funding can be claimed via your learner's ILR record on a monthly basis going forward. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this process is the same as for supporting any learner that requires adjustments on their program. The only difference here is the evidence that is made available to the ESFA. So often, kind of putting into place adjustments for your learners and claiming funding can be seen as 2 separate, perhaps not connected processes, and that is not the case at all. They are absolutely linked, and actually funding can often be seen as a consequence of putting into place the right adjustments for your learners in cases, as I say, where there are costs incurred in doing so.
Brilliant, thanks, Aaron. We have had just one question pop in, thanks Nicola, into the Q&A box, and I realised we've only got a couple minutes left, so we might go a couple minutes over, so I appreciate everyone's time on that. Aaron, how do you evidence how the module supports the skills, knowledge and behaviours of their apprenticeship?
Absolutely. So that all links back to the start of this process, and us looking to assess what the impact of the apprentices or learners' need or condition is. So if if your learner has been identified on Cognassist, that first stage, as we say, is to assess the impact of that. At this stage of the program, we may not be entirely sure, and that's why that iteration is so crucial down the line. But during the program, what aspects of the program do we expect to be impacted by that learner's condition? So, for example, it could be in the delivery of their program. It could be in their assignments, in their coursework, in putting together their portfolio, and all of those things have the potential to impact the program, given that they're such core components of it. So, from that stage, we know that the personalized learning journey and the modules of Cognassist are specifically tailored around durable skills that are linked to those domains that the learner has been identified in, and therefore do those modules directly support the apprentice in mitigating and managing those difficulties that are caused by their condition. So the way that we evidence those is in relation to the skills that they've developed, but also in the sort of tangible things that we can measure linked to the impact. So earlier, for example, I mentioned a potential impact in things like assignments, in things like coursework, in things like portfolios. Those are all things that we can measure. So, for example, has the learner made progress in their portfolio, in their coursework, in their assignments? And those are all things that we can measure. And if so, then we can judge that the completion of the modules have made a contribution towards supporting that learner's needs. Hopefully that was a useful answer to that question.
That's a brilliant answer, Aaron. Thank you. I think I've got time for just a couple more. So one from Sharon. For those not flagging on Cognassist, but who have self-declared ADHD or autism, for example, but have no evidence, how do you manage those?
Yeah, so that is certainly probably the most challenging circumstance that we can get, where we know that there is something, and we know that it does have a condition, but there's no evidence to kind of start off that process. Now, in that case, of course, the sort of the simple answer is it depends on the learner. And we want to make sure that we are being, kind of pragmatic and tailored to each learner's condition. But the good thing about the current funding rules is that the evidence of need identification doesn't have to be a formal diagnosis. So there are other avenues that we can potentially explore. So, for example, we may wish to explore something like a screening assessment, which gives us an initial indication of need and supports that. We may want to take into account evidence from the employer potentially. So, for example, if there's a workplace needs assessment, if they've completed something like occupational health as well, that can support it. So there are different avenues of evidence that we can consider, depending on the learner's situations. But certainly, I would say that kind of screening assessments can be a really useful starting point to kind of give you the evidence of what you know exists, but currently can't evidence. So there's a variety of kind of recognized autism assessments, ADHD assessments that the learner can self-complete asynchronously, and the results of that can then give you the evidence that you might need further down the line during a funding claim.
Thank you, Aaron. I also find that just completing an assessment, for example, Cognassist, gives you that springboard to have a conversation with the learner. So even though if they don't identify, it starts the conversation, it opens up those questions and just makes it easier for the learner to start talking about things they do find challenging.
Absolutely.
And just one last question. So cognitive challenges for a person with ADHD, how do you know whether the information you have passed on has been taken in by that person if their attention is fleeting and they don't want to repeat the information back to you? So I suppose a couple of ideas of strategies from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So a good way that we often approach these situations is kind of twofold. Firstly, we understand that that perhaps the learner might not want to repeat the information back to us exactly, but can we adapt the way that they're recalling, for example? So, for example, can we ask them kind of practical questions about the subject matter that is not direct recall, but therefore allows the learner to apply that knowledge in answering those questions. A particularly good strategy that we find to be quite helpful is that if we can focus those kind of practical questions on something that the learner is interested in, then getting them to apply that knowledge into a subject of interest to them can be a great way of validating knowledge, and also right the way through after sort of that sort of piece of teaching, keeping the progress of the learner under review, and making sure that the progress that we would expect them to make, they are actually making. a really good example of this that we've seen previously of our learners with ADHD actually was applying their knowledge into a gaming setup. So so this learner was into sort of gaming, and so asking them questions that they could actually apply their knowledge in this sort of gaming context, that therefore sparked their interest and therefore allowed them to answer the questions and apply back their knowledge, but without that being in a direct kind of recall based way, if that makes sense.
Does. Brilliant. Thanks so much, Aaron. I'll just move to the next slide. I'm just conscious of time, and we do appreciate it. So I don't know if you want to just give any final thoughts or kind of like a bit of a wrap up just from your side, if that's all right, Aaron.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And apologies again, as I say, for the hiccup halfway through. I think my main takeaway for anyone on this session today is not to think of reasonable adjustments and funding claims as two separate processes. They are absolutely intrinsically linked, and considering them like that can be a massively helpful way of ensuring that firstly your learners are getting the support that they need on their programs, but also that puts the foundations in place for you as the provider to be able to claim that funding immediately with no further action or evidence collection being necessary. So certainly my sort of biggest takeaway from today is that these are not separate processes, and they should be treated as one combined process right the way through from the start of program all the way through to endpoint until a learner's last day on program. That would be my key takeaway from today's session.
Thank you, Aaron. We've obviously gone over a bit, and thank you for those questions that have come through. I've noticed there's a few more in the chat. We'll endeavour to get back to you in time as well. Yes, yep, there will be a recording. Just seen that question pop up. So this recording will be circulated to everyone who registered later in the week, and we'll also put it across on our socials as well for anyone who'd like to watch on that. So just going to go through just on the final slide, but mainly just to say thank you. Of course, if you'd like to know a bit more about Cognassist, just simply scan that screen. But thank you massively to Aaron for being our guest speaker today. We really appreciate your time on this. And it was fascinating to hear about your process and how you kind of follow it through at Multiverse. So we really do appreciate your time on that. And thank you so much, Louise, as well. So thank you for being our in-house expert as well. But yeah, and of course, thank you to all of you for attending. We really appreciate it. Until next time, goodbye and have a great rest of your day.